the Khodorkovsky room of St. Anthony's College of University of Oxford. I greet everyone, and we are continuing today the very, from my point of view, extremely interesting topic, which was started with Professor Ibadoghlu last time about effects of the resource curse. And today we'll go more to the explanations of the mechanisms of how does it work, resource curse. Well, first of all, I would love to tell you that as all the theories and approaches and phenomena, this one as well is in the process of permanent development. So the state of the theory, which was like even last decade, is already different now. So we do have transformation and evolution of certain provisions and ideas of the theory of resource curse. And I would say it started with more determinant nature of it, and it's moving towards more flexible idea that it's not as inevitable as the founders of the Rentier theory of the resource curse theory used to say. So today we're gonna, here is the plan. So we're gonna discuss what resource curse is, its definitions, approaches to it, and criticism of these approaches. We'll discuss the mechanisms. Specifically, I would love to elaborate the theory of Terelyn Carl, the professor of Stanford University, who made a very significant contribution of study of a resource curse with her book, Paradox of Plenty, and with the unit of analysis of petrostates. And then we'll do a more entertaining part of our lecture will be the historical comparative analysis of two oil booms in Azerbaijan. And in the end, we'll try to answer the question whether a resource curse is avoidable. So let's start with definitions. So resource curse or paradox of plenty refers to failure of many resource-rich states to benefit fully from the natural resource wealth and for the governments of these states to respond effectively to the public welfare needs. They tend to have higher rates of authoritarianism and conflict, these states, lower rates of economic growth and stability. And the third major indication is oil, mineral, gas wealth, as Professor Ibadoghlu told us in the first lecture, is distinct from the others because of large upfront costs, long production timelines, site-specific nature, scale of rents, price and production volatility, and non-renewable nature, as well as secrecy of industry. So, paradox of plenty is a framework for decision-making constructed by and based on highly politicized allocation of rents. And we discussed it already in the lecture on rentier states. Why different, and that's what paradox of plenty is about. Why different oil exporting governments in contexts which differ across regime type, strategic considerations, social structure, culture, size, they choose common development path, pursue trajectories and produce perverse outcomes. In this case of paradox of plenty, petrodollars are substituted for statecraft. rulers lose capacity to say no. So what are the effects of resource curse? Again, it's authoritarianism, taxation on extractive industry instead of taxation of citizens. Usually, resource curse is affiliated with conflicts. So there is a data which proves that civil wars in such states are twice as likely. Inefficient spending and borrowing also is affiliated with resource curse. Dutch disease, and that's when the development of one sector economy, like the mineral sector of economy, hits the other sectors or is developing at the expense of the others, first of all, manufacturing and agriculture, which leads in turn to the inflation or exchange rate appreciation and shifting labor capital from the productive sector to the extractive one. It also affects patriarchy and gender-based relations, which means it consolidates, it reinforces patriarchal relationship in the society, and particularly gender. Women usually are discriminated, non-represented, underrepresented in the oil-based sector because, as we just heard, that Dutch disease undermines manufacturing sector. Weaker institution development because when you have a choice whether to make institutional change, improve your bureaucratic structure, make some serious reforms in the way of you govern, on the one hand, and on the other hand, you have money, so you can easily basically substitute this reform with the money. Of course, there is a tendency to go for an easy way when you have money for it. And of course, this environmental and social impact. So there are various theories, approaches. Why does it happen? So the most popular is economic, is Dutch disease, which we just mentioned, that Dutch disease affects the meaning of the Dutch disease is when your economy is overly dependent on one sector, it hits the manufacturing and agriculture sector, it hits the other sectors. This doesn't happen, of course, mechanically. So this is one explanation, economic explanation, but there is also the other explanations of resource curse, and they are political. They include cognitive, societal, and state-centered. So state-centered is, for instance, Rentier state theory. And so resource curse theories and approaches to these theories, they are permanently revised, and they are subject of critical assessment. For instance, there is a group of scholars and experts who question the whole idea that, there is no such a thing, resource curse. First of all, your sample is not sufficient to make the generalization. And indeed, if you look at various studies, you will see, for instance, some group in one region is studied, or the other group in other region. So these critics, they say there is not enough evidence to say that a resource curse exists. Then, for instance, there is the other criticism is about the conflicts, that resource curse is necessarily related to conflicts. They discovered, some studies like Smith in 2004 discovered that oil wealth is connected to regime durability, actually. It decreases chances of war. Then the other studies say that degree of rents matter. So if the rents are 40 or 50% of your GDP, then it's a high degree, and it has one effect. If it's 30-40, it's medium, it might be a low effect, and probably low 20-30 might have no effect whatsoever. And so far, and for instance, one of the direction of the analysis of resource curves, it's the institutional analysis of institutions. So, for instance, there was a study that if the institutions are grabber friendly, then there is no growth. If production friendly, then there is growth. Gubad in 2005. Then they say, for instance, that the low degree of trade openness is more important than the institutions. But we're coming closer to the institutional explanation. So you had in your list of literature a chapter from the Terry Lynn Carl's book, Paradox of Plenty, the famous book in which she published in 1997. She explains her approach, elaborating of these two concepts of structure and agency. So why is it important to understand what is structure and what is agency? It gives you the idea of whether the phenomena which we deal with is possible to change or it's not possible to change. So structure means determinism. Structure means no choice. It's recurrent patterned arrangements which influence the choices of the individual, meaning that there are objective factors which basically affect your choice, and you are not free to make that choice. The agency, it's the opposite. It's when you have freedom of choice and a lot depends on you, you can influence things by your choices. Not the objective situation influences you, but you can influence these things. And there is a group of theories, for instance, the rational choice theories, because choices depend on the leaders, but not on economic or social structures. Terry Lynn Carl says that in fact, the structured agency, they ignore the institutions which were created and the history of institutions. So it's not just the structure, but the history of institutions, and which reduces the range of decision making. So she puts together these two approaches and calls it structural contingency. She also chooses for her analysis the phenomena or what she calls petrostates. It's a special category of the rentier states, which are dependent on the petroleum sector. She says that basically her approach allows to differentiate not only petrostates. There are any state which is exceedingly dependent on certain sector of economy can be called that kind of state. For instance, service state or manufacturing state or agricultural state or something like that. So she basically says it doesn't matter, but then she goes deeper And it's partly the answer of one of you, the question which you asked last time. I wonder who that was, Svetlana or Somaya, but one of you asked the question about mineral resources and things like that. So she, as I said, so her hypothesis, she tries to answer the question, why countries, depending on the same expert, but they are in various parts of the world, and that's her sample of countries, reflects also. She gets countries from absolutely different areas of the world, regions of the world, to show the effect of the political economy of petroleum. So totally different countries with different size, different culture, different history. But then she shows that they all display a similar way of state which guides the development, the political structures, social structures, and other common peculiarities which are caused by the deep mechanisms of political economy of oil. So she says that commodity-led growth leads to changes in notional or property rights, correlation of forces and interest groups in the society. These changes affect the revenue base of state, and that's where the key of her argument, that the main indicator of, and the main unit or the main mechanism through which oil affects the politics, social structure, and economy through state is changing basis of taxation. So she says in all of them, you will see, and we will see it soon, in all of them, the corporate taxes are taking over the individual taxes or taxes on the productive sector of economy, corporate oil taxes. So she calls the process when this sector of economy, petroleum, affects the state institutions and start to change them in a certain way. She calls it petrolization. It's when states become dependent on oil exports and their polities develop addiction to petrodollars. So she gives you the criteria. So high share of oil production in GDP and of oil exports, in total exports. She also quotes the World Bank criteria. It should be 10% of GDP and 40% of exports to be considered oil dependent. But for her analysis, she picks up capital deficient oil exporters. Mexico, Algeria, Indonesia, Nigeria, Venezuela, Iran, and others. Basically, she picked up 6 of them. Why did she do it? If we look at this table, you will see that capital surplus countries is the ones which have a small size of population and big resources, meaning the ratio of resources per capita is high, but in capital deficient countries, ratio per capita is low. The first category and this is usually reduced to a region. We know this is in the Arab states, and we analyzed it as the rentier states last time. But the capital deficient countries, they're very diverse. They're very diverse. They're from the different regions. As I said, they have different degree even and history of democratic institutions. So they have larger skilled labor force, more diversified economy, absorbed oil revenues from their booms. They have been net importers of capital, and they have a shorter horizon of the rents coming from oil. So it creates greater tension for the rulers. So they've been even characterized by greater effort towards diversification, and their share in world production is larger than the others. So if you look at them, this is so the sample of her case studies, which she chosen to demonstrate the effect of the resource curse. You can see the rents as percentage of exports. 91 Venezuela, Nigeria 91, Algeria 98, Indonesia, and if you look at these two, you will see they're smaller. Why Indonesia and Norway has a smaller dependence on oil sector, we will discuss later, but now we will come to more specific. What does oil do to these states? So she considers that oil wealth dramatically changes the state institution, especially when petroleum exploitation coincide with modern state building. Most of these states, and some of these states, particularly in the recent, in the 20th century, they got rid of their colonial status, and the large corporations moved in immediately. So Terlyn Carl says that if the large commercial development of oil, intense commercial development of oil, coincides with the state building, modern state building, then the probability of the resource curse is very high, because there is no enough capacity of state to resist the objective forces which influence the logic of politics and economics under the influence of the oil wealth. So she says that when the state building just beginning and the oil corporations enter, they develop a special relationship, the result of bargaining between foreign companies and local rulers leads to overly centralized political power, strong networks of complicity of private and public sector actors, uneven mineral-based development subsidized by the oil rents, and the replacement of domestic productive tax revenues by petrodollars. And that's how the framework for decision-making changes in a manner that in the future it starts to affect the decision-making. So it turns into a vicious circle. So if you look in what she considers the critical as an indicator and of effect of the resource curse, you will see that she compares Colombia, which doesn't have oil, with Venezuela. And you can see the percentage of taxes, particularly these relations between individual and corporate taxes. So if you look at the Venezuela in the times of the oil boom, the corporate taxes have 70% as compared to corporate taxes in Colombia of 74% of taxes, 70 is corporate taxes, meaning the oil-based taxes, and only 4, 6, these are domestic indirect taxes. This is, of course, much smaller amount if you look at the corporate taxes. So this what shows the tremendous difference between the revenue base of oil-rich and non-oil-rich states. So why this molding is happening? She says, petrostate is more dependent on one commodity, oil, exploitation of which is first, remember first lecture by Professor Ibadoghlu, he told you what's the difference between mining, other mining and oil resources. So basically, she's saying that oil is more depletable, more capital intensive, more enclave oriented, more centralized in the state, and most importantly, it's more rent producing than any other commodity. So this eventually leads to over-reliance on petroleum industry as basis of all economic activity. It leads to lack of productive linkages and dominance of fiscal ones. It leads to primacy of state in the ownership and disposition of oil revenues. It eventually leads to perceived necessity to accelerate development very rapidly. That's what we call the Rentier behavior, and what she called petromania, belief in large projects at home and abroad, or Rentier. So politically speaking, power in such petrostate rests on dual capacity to extract rents externally and to distribute them internally according to political logic. For instance, we've heard about patronage system, so they're creating the hierarchies of the dependent circles, and this, of course, affects the social structure also. It undermines the development of bourgeoisie. Instead, it results in extensive bureaucratic apparatus. So that all affects, of course, the prospects for development of both state and political institutions. So there is no, as a result, there is no incentive to decentralize power. Quite the opposite. The more revenues pouring in the highly centralized power, the more they lead to its great centralization. She distinguishes two groups of countries, which she picked up for her petrostate analysis and resource curse or paradox of plenty. She analyzes Venezuela, Iran, Nigeria, and Algeria, and separately Indonesia and Norway, because we saw on that table that these two countries, they exposed much less dependence on the oil sector. So she says that these four countries, although they are all located in different places, Algeria, North Africa, Nigeria, Africa, Venezuela, Latin America, Iran, Persian Gulf. So what are these commonalities between them? Well, first, the entry of foreign oil companies happened into the weak states, and the states still didn't have the bureaucratic capacity strong enough to guide development in the way which would lead to the sort of positive outcomes. Second, imposition of income tax on companies as a prime source of state fiscal revenues. In Venezuela and Iran, it was an old phenomenon because their oil production has been has a long history for a century. And in the rest, it's relatively new phenomenon. So the other common feature that there was a maximizing external rate extraction of rents for domestic distribution via public spending according to political logic. Basically, that's what we've been speaking about all this time. So they all have the same behavior. And all of them are characterized by regime change that either reinforce or counteract reliance on oil rents. All these countries were involved in the regime change in various forms, Iranian revolution and Venezuelan changes and all the others. So if you look, particularly her focus is Venezuela. And I forgot this was supposed to go a bit earlier, but you can see how compared to the Western Hemisphere developed state and even developing countries, the corporate taxes in petrostate is tremendously higher. 70 versus 14 in Europe, and developing countries 1653. If you look at them, yes, and here you can also see the development of corporate taxes in the countries in comparison perspective. So if you look in Norway, for instance, corporate taxes level is in 1.6 in 1972 and 16 or 17 in 1985. And please compare it to Venezuela, again, 48 or 49 in 85. So again, that's the comparison. And non-oil developing countries, there is no series sort of non-available, but basically you can compare it looking at the amount of taxes on goods and services. Again, there is underdevelopment of taxes, of this category of taxes in Venezuela, and sort of developing countries have much higher. Oops. So why Indonesia was an exception? We've just seen that Indonesia had different indicators of petrostate. Well, it did indeed escape severe economic deterioration and regime instability. So what happened, that this key factor of coincidence of the entrance of the oil corporation and the beginning of the modern state building did not coincide. In fact, the oil companies moved in later, at later stages of the modern state building, because it was happening in Second World War. There were delays. There was, well, in a sense, war appeared to be a blessing because that prevented the early entrance of the oil companies at the moment, at the sensitive moment when the country was building its institutions. So what were the policy decisions in Indonesia as a result? First of all, they strengthened state capacity by borrowing international expertise. So they created an economic team with a sovereign sort of functioning, in a sense, which was outward looking, and they were intensely learning from the international experience, in terms of bureaucratic bureaucracy and functioning. So they also avoided.
Alieva, we lost your voice.
Oops.
Could you check again?
Still, no, you don't hear me?
Oh, voice.
You hear me?
Microphone.
No, you don't hear me?
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Here. No? Should I continue or not? Gabe, you don't hear me? No? You don't hear me? Does anyone hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. Okay, so maybe Gubad had some problems with the connection. Okay.
No, I have the voice, no problem.
Okay,
Sorry.
great. So they also avoided quantitative controls on exchange rate. So they devalued regularly currency. In certain years, they were devaluing currency. And they applied the balanced budget rule, which had the following effects. On expenditure side, it made austerity dominated. It's basically antithesis to better patterns. And on the revenue side, domestic taxes increased ninefold. So this means that the country, before the oil revenue started to influence the state institutions, developed certain level of the bureaucracy which allowed it to resist future distortions which are brought by the logic of the petrolization. Then, and no less important decision was to adopt agriculture, rice self-sufficiency, as a principal objective. And that was very important because it counteracted the main bias of oil-led development. And this agricultural primary objective stayed there very consistently in all the government plans, 5-year plans of Suharto regime. So, in spite of the oil boom, it avoided severe deterioration of agricultural sector, which plugged other petrostates. By the time of 73 oil boom, Indonesia had a better capacity to manage an oil boom and political stability. And it exposed less fiscal dependence on petroleum, not permitted by rent seeking, with less institutional rigidity, but more characterized by fiscal austerity and domestic taxation. The other case, which she says is different, Norway, which proves importance of stateness and democracy. So Norway was the country in the 60s when it entered the oil boom era as a country with established, developed institutes of state bureaucracy and democratic institutions. So unlike the other countries, they didn't encounter a poor country, weak state, undeveloped social forces, or predatory authoritarian rules. So Norway in 1960s was already one of the wealthiest, equitable, as most democratic countries with diversified economy. Poverty was eliminated at that time. Unemployment was close to nil. So it also characterized by professionalism of civil service and vested non-oil-based interest in democratic context. I would suggest, Mert Uzun asked the question, but I'm afraid I already went past that. If you just keep it, and unless it becomes more clear as a result of our, the rest of the lecture, we will come back to it. So, from our point of view, when I was leading my center back home, we undertaken a comparative analysis of 2 oil booms in Azerbaijan. The reason for comparing the two oil booms was that the effects, social political effects of 2 oil booms was drastically different within 1 century. So the first oil boom, which Azerbaijan has experienced, was when it was part of the Russian Empire. So it was not a state, but the way how the oil production and access to oil resources developed and was designed, that had tremendous impact on the communities who lived there and in the societies who lived there. So we ended up in the end of the 20th century from a very diverse political picture and decentralized government in the early century before, and century after, we ended up a classical rentier state with extremely centralized and authoritarian government. And probably Azerbaijan of end of the 20th century probably best fits the description of Erlin Karl, when the arrival of the oil companies happened when it just became an independent country. After 70 years of being part of the Soviet Union, with extremely weak institutions, bureaucratic institutions. The Azerbaijan appeared to be open to the oil corporations and oil development. But in the 19th century, it was quite different. Let me show you first that we started this project with the history of oil development. Azerbaijan is very unique, particularly Baku area, that's where the capital is. It's a 17th century painting of Baku. This is the very old manual oil wells. So basically, at least 3 villages near the capital still have the artifacts of the oldest in the world oil development. So we documented all of them. We found all of them. We found the oil wells, which go a few centuries back, at least. There were 2 kinds of them, the manual. So first of all, let me show you the symbol of the old history of Azerbaijan. It was very closely related to the oil and gas reserves, because that's where Zoroastrianism also had its spread. I'm sure people from Iran know what I speak about. It's the Zoroastrian temple in Surakhane. And it was mainly because the flames of the natural gas sort of deposits, they were coming out, and it would attract pilgrims from India, from Iran, from all over. Parsis from India were coming. So this is a Zoroastrian, very typical, and Alexander Dumas stayed here for a few months observing the life of the pilgrims in the 19th century. That's the first pipeline, primitive pipeline. That's how this is the handmade oil well of at least early 19th century. And that's how it was going to the underground oil reservoirs. This is the second type of oil well, manual oil well. There were 2 kinds of them. One with wooden lining, the one which you saw first, and this is the stone lining. So, and this is the underground oil reservoirs made of stone. They're interconnected here. I went down. It's probably of 15th century oil reservoir. So you go down by stairs. It's a very sort of tidy, interesting reservoir, made construction, stone construction. It was actually described by the famous Austrian diplomat of the 17th century, Engelbert Kämpfer. And we just found it. We went to the village, we walked around and we found it. This is the entrance there. So you can see this, the remains of the bricks, stones, limestones, this actually. So you can go down and see that interesting construction. So it's just for your entertainment, a bit of history. This is still the manual extraction of oil extraction. And that's what happened when the drilling started. These are the first, they were made of, as you see, they were made of wood. And that's why the fires were quite well spread. So The effect of the first oil boom was amazing. We will come to it later. But there were a few very unusual things happening. First of all, the oil barons, what they were called, they were reinvesting, contrary to the logic of the resource curse, they were reinvesting in the real sector of economy. And the second, what they were doing, they were involved in the philanthropy and other patronage of arts. They were also moving the modernization of the country, including women's rights. So starting from 1861, you have enormous rise of refineries. Everyone went for refineries. They would go, they would open refineries, the doctors, everyone would, but interestingly enough, it was not just the sort of oil extraction. It was the refineries. The oil in the Absheron Peninsula was very shallow. It was shallow, it was a high quality so-called white oil. And we discovered a very old house, which actually had the spring of oil in the floor. So you still have it. It's probably the house of the early 19th or end of 18th century. And the owners still have it as a storage, but it's amazing. It's a very symbolic of Baku at that time, that it was very easy. It was, the oil was very shallow and it would go. So what was happening in the Russian economy at that time? Well, Russian economy at that time was very diverse. First, it was very diverse. And as you see, the most, the textiles manufacturing was actually the major employer as compared to the oil, for instance, 27,000. But you can see from this that it was diverse. This is already the technological progress, but this is the oil fountain. This is the first in the world refinery. It's still preserved. This is how the process of refinery looked like at that time. The classes benefited a lot from the oil revenues. This is actually my grandfather. He was a landowner. So by selling parts of this land, you could get profit. This is his father. But they were not the main, and this is his family house. You look, it looks quite European. At that time, or for instance, this was part of the frescoes in his house, grandfather's house. That's all oil money. But they were not the main heroes. Who were the main heroes of this oil boom? Were actually uneducated peasants of the Baku villages. Why did they benefit? I'll tell you why. So this is one of the heroes of that time. He was, as I said, uneducated farmer, started his activities as a stonemason, and then he got the piece of land, and he became overnight, as because of the let me go a bit further to tell you. So what happened in the middle of 19th century? why it led to enormous amount of private entrepreneurs who were not characterized by the rent-seeking behavior in spite of the enormous reaches. You would become a billionaire overnight. So how and why, which reforms were in place? Well, when this commercial exploration of oil started. So in the middle of the 19th century, the Tsar Alexander II has the vision, very open-minded vision, that Russia needs serious reforms in order to catch up and compete with the most advanced countries in the world, including in the oil industry, which was becoming a very important commodity. So there were 4 critical reforms at that time, which led to the positive outcome, or the outcome of the oil exploration, which I told you about. So first of all, the legalization of private land ownership, because when Russia colonized Azerbaijan, it basically, of course, it appropriated all the lands which belonged to the Khans and local beks and everything. But on the other hand, it privatized it legally in a sense that it gave us small pieces of it. I mean, they were very rich. I mean, my great-grandfather, he was very rich, but he received from Russia a little part of what he ever had in terms of land. But it was legally a private ownership. Then what happened in a European way? Then what happened? In 1864, Alexander II undertaken absolutely unique judicial reform, which practically made judiciary independent from the political power. The reform did not touch immediately the peripheries, particularly the Muslim peripheries like Azerbaijan was, but in general, the liberalization of rule, including judicial reform, which led to appearance of the enormous amount of lawyers, professionals, and you know, they were all participating. There was a strong need in them because there was the oil resources were privatized, and now you see that the other important in 1872 was a decree on privatization of the oil industry. So remember Rentier states, all of them had nationalized or belonging to state oil resources, while in the early first boom in Azerbaijan in 1874, there was a decree on privatization. One important quote, because it was not fully privatization, but still, you know, you could enjoy quite a big autonomy in how you disposed your land, and introduction of foreign capital. And of course, you had the Nobel and Rothschild. All oil-bearing land was divided in equal pieces, plots, and then they will be sold in the auctions, and they were sold in the open auctions. So anyone, and they were very inexpensive, particularly the first auctions, they were very inexpensive. So a regular person could come to these auctions and buy a piece of land. And guess what? Most of them were lucky, And that's what led to the enormous amount of private entrepreneurs, national bourgeoisie, these rich people whom I showed you, the uneducated farmers they became, but let me show you. Yeah, it's already the political effect of all that, but that's the enormous increase. So this is one of the famous oil barons who reinvested his riches into the shipbuilding, manufacturing, agriculture. So that's one of his mansions. It's now a museum of history. And I actually had my office at some point in this building. It's just one of the halls of that beautiful buildings. So there were quite a few of them. Well, first of all, Tagiv, his name, he promoted women's rights. And with his money, it was possible, and with his passion, it was possible to open the first secular school for girls in Azerbaijan, for Muslim girls, European style Muslim school for Muslim girls. I think this is the building, right? Or this one. One of them is Oil Academy, where Professor Ibadoghlu teaches. So he will help me to say which one is the former women's school. Gubad Bey, which one is?
The right side.
On the right side, yes. So this is the academy, Oil Academy. Okay, so
Mayor of Gubad City.
Okay, yes, mayor. True. That's all true. So this is the class of this gymnasium. This is my grandmother actually here. Here is she again. That's how it looked like in the early 20th century. So the gymnasium started to be built in 1901. I think it was finished, I don't remember. But it was quite difficult, of course, to build that school. But it's interesting that this promotion of women's rights was coming from men and uneducated farmers. So this is the investments and philanthropy by Azerbaijani oil barons. So you see Zainalabdin Tagiv, the one whom I told you, he was reinvesting in textile, shipping, trade mills, fisheries, water supply system, oil pipeline, philanthropy, schools, publications, enormous. Azerbaijan at that point had more than 63 newspapers, journals, other periodicals. And one of the famous was this satirical journal, Mullah Nasreddin, which was anti-clerical, criticized, Muslim mullahs and their influence, particularly coming from Iran. And it was published for, if I'm not mistaken, at least for 20 years. And was very popular all over the East. And naturally, you had a parliament. The first parliament, interestingly enough, took place in this building of the meeting of the parliament. Took place in the gymnasium, women's gymnasium, and that's what it was with Azerbaijan in the 19th century. So there was private ownership of oil industry accessible to the wider local population due to transparent auctions, inexpensive cost of land, and independent judiciary, which would protect the property rights. There were favorable conditions for competition, which contributed to the market economy. It was also formation of diverse economic units, independent economic groups, middle class, oil elite, barons, as well as the civil society. So there was quite a vibrant civil society because there were independent producers, there were professional organizations, oil workers, the transport workers, professionals from the other fields, or businessmen. So various interest groups, and it ended up in parliamentary republic, Azerbaijan independent parliamentary republic in 1918-1920. That's when the Russian Empire collapsed. So everyone got a chance to establish their republics. When the delegation came to the Paris conference, the Woodrow Wilson said, particularly stressed the vision and the values of the First Democratic Republic. He said that we shared the concepts and values of liberty, rights, and justice. As you know, the Republic didn't last long, although it had a tremendous impact. It adopted all the liberal laws in the first 2 years, or made a lot of good reforms. But then a Red Army came, and literally in 2 weeks, in 2 months, sorry, it nationalized the whole industry, including, the copper, other mining and joint stock company, electrical, and oil, of course. Everything was nationalized. We will pass by these 70 years, but what happened when the Soviet Union collapsed, and we already discussed it a bit in the previous sessions. We discussed the post-Soviet rentier states, and that's where the combination of actually 3 factors came together. According to Terelin Karl's theory, you had the modern state building coinciding with entrance of the transnational corporations, and you also had really bad legacies, institutional legacies. You had the centralized power, totalitarian sort of structure of society, totalitarian institutions, and according to the logic which was just described by her, that exacerbate these legacies, institutional legacies. If you look at this picture, which is a huge contrast with democratic parliament, which we had in the early 20th century, you have a patrimonial sort of structure of the government. This is the first president, not first, we had for a short period of time the democratic president. So this is Heydar Aliyev, who was a former communist boss, but who came in 94. Then the power would transfer to his son, not without participation of the countries, leading Western countries who had their oil companies operating in Azerbaijan. And one of the regional heads of executive power, just wanting to flatter the power, put a little picture of, at that time, the son was quite small, the grandchild of the Heydar Aliyev, the former communist boss, and called this slogan, this is the past, present and future of independent Azerbaijan, basically past, present, and future. That is, of course, very sad, because at the moment we had a permanent resistance to the extremely authoritarian regime at that time. And I think when this guy was arrested, it was 2 or 3 years ago, yeah, that we had 150 political prisoners. The guy was arrested simply for graffiti. And here is the attempt of the revolution in Azerbaijan, Orange Revolution in 2005. It was in the eve of the parliamentary elections. So it was, and look at the slogans which people have. So they're already totally different attitude to oil as compared to what the role oil played a century ago. So there was quite a, we also spoke about the extreme and exacerbated increasing role of state in economy and politics as compared to the other actors, to the society, and etc. One of the reasons why it was happening, there has never been a counterbalance to the investments in the oil sector, which means to the state, yeah, because rents were accruing directly to the government or to the state. There's never been the counterbalancing investments in the civil society. For instance, if you look at the aid to Azerbaijan, it was extremely low as compared to other countries, Armenia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan. I'm not speaking about just humanitarian aid. It's something, of course, there were distracting elements, but also that included the direct support for civil society. So that actually exacerbated the imbalance state versus society. And I think that aggravated the petrolization of the state. I think Professor Ibadoghlu will speak about it, or has already spoken about it. But it's about how the structure of state budget was changing, and you can see the enormous sort of increase of the budget spending to the industry. So there are all sorts of interesting indications of the resource curse, which is confirmed on Azerbaijan's case study. You can also see the direct dependence on the GDP growth, which is of course oil-based, and budget spending. Also confirms the previous. And what's interesting, if you look at the key characteristics of index of economic freedom, you can understand where the difference is. So property rights, very low. And if you compare it with the situation 100 years ago, you know, the property rights were protected better because of the independent judiciary. So all these indicators, they also confirm the situation. In 1992, when Azerbaijan got an independence in 91, but by 92, we had a first democratically elected government. We had Thatcher. She was not in power already, but she visited Azerbaijan. So she was one of the lobbyists of the BP. And that's how the companies were bringing in their influence. So what does Terelin Karl, for instance, say what are the ways out of the resource curse? Well, usually, along with the other scholars, there is an advice to put oil revenues in the trust fund abroad, so-called sterilization of oil revenues. Then use market mechanisms to check role of state in economy, privatization, deregulation of prices, and other market mechanisms. Then there should be stable environment for property rights. In order to avoid Dutch disease, there should be improvement of productivity in agriculture and industry. The financial sector should reform to increase independence of central bank and in general strengthen the banking system. Improve judicial system, again, judiciary is important to secure property rights and better fight corruption. And cut the public spendings as much as possible, resist temptation to increase consumption, avoid public large projects, instead to invest in education and health. But then she comments and says that in petrostates, it's hard to implement basically all these recommendations. Because she says that the key to successful reform in economy, it's not economic, it's political. So she, as well as some other experts, they agree that in order to prevent resource curse under the influence of the oil exploration, certain institutions and reforms should be in place already. And again, there should be independent judiciary, should be independent central bank, transparent budgetary practices in order to resist this effect of petrolization. There should be also social pressures, political to petrolization. So because too many actors, social and political actors, now connect their activities to the oil profit. Yeah, it's important to build up certain social and political groups who are separate from the oil development or even opposed, like for instance, Association of Fishermen or environmentalists, right? There should be creative resistance, she says, both domestic and external. Civil service should be protected from patronage, non-oil-based tax system, and transparent democratic institution, and should have non-oil-based tax system and transparent democratic institutions. She also says that the periods of low oil price is the window of opportunity when these objective factors or the influence of structure is weakening. So you can move in and try to change the situation and run the reforms. So this might be strengthening of non-oil-based interests. In Norway, it's chambers of commerce and civil society projects, fishing and environment. In Ecuador and Guinea, it's indigenous population. These are groups which are not related to the oil rents or interests in the getting oil rents. it's important to limit oil-based borrowing. All these, she concludes, it's not attractive. It's compared to the easy access to the money. All these measures, they're more difficult, they're time-consuming, and they're not rewarded. And the problem is that the volatility, the shock, external shocks from the decline of the price and decline of the oil production might be so devastating that it's worth to make these choices. And so she says that high prices of oil, which can come next, will close this window of opportunity. And that's what is paradox of plenty. So let me finish here. And if there are, we'll start with questions and then we'll make a little, how much time do we have? No, we don't have time. We have 20 minutes, right? Or more? We have more. Okay, so we can
30 minutes.
30 minutes. So we can
for fighting for better autonomy. So I would say in that case, like the solving the political problems also will be one of the important things.
Right. Yes. What do you think, Professor Ibadoghlu? Let me also involve you in this discussion.
I think the Somalia point is very good point regarding of the institution. But really, the experience of the Norway shows that the amount of the research course depend on the level of the development of democratic institution. Is one of the main point. And there is also another issues regarding the how to avoid the research course. It's depend on the rules. I mean, rules also part of the institutions. If you mentioned the balance rule, you mentioned the withdrawal rule, and also debit rule. The government adopted rules for the governance of the oil, gas, and other minerals revenue. It will help about the research course in the economic context. And rules is institution is very, very important for the award the research course.
Mm-hmm. But I would say that Paul Collier actually says it's possible. It's possible not only to avoid, it's possible to alter it. So all these recommendations of the international financial organizations, World Bank, for instance, this measure of transparency initiative, extractive industries transparency initiatives, they actually are directed to alter the resource curse to prevent its further development, even if it started already. But countries who join it, they have this intention to, to change something. The problem is how effective are these institutions, and whether they indeed successful in this function. What do you think? First of all, who didn't speak yet? Mert, do you have an idea on this in this regard? Right. Corporate taxes may be discouraging. Yes. How do we counteract those corporate taxes? Gubad Bey, what do you think? How can one resist the temptation to, base your revenues on corporate taxes? How can one resist that? We don't hear you. You have to
Sorry. It depends on the legal regime. Some countries prefer the concession contract, some countries prefer the production sharing agreement. But if the production sharing agreement, the companies must share the profit, oil and the gas and other minerals. In this case, the role of the corporate tax is low. But if the contract base of the concession and in this case, the corporate tax makes sense, and I think the corporate tax became one of the tools for the regulation, legislation. But many times, the most countries, they prefer the production sharing agreement for the exploration of the oil and the gas resources than mining sector. The mining sector, they prefer the concession agreement. And that's why it depends on the each minerals and the hydrocarbons are you going to exploit.
One of the characteristics of the 19th century Russian bureaucracy that it was highly professional. It consisted of very educated people. And although corruption was there always, but in terms of personalities like ministers, there was a quite famous minister, Witte, who was he appointed in 1893 or something, who opened the doors for foreign investors in spite of the laws, legal sort of limitations. So he was very forward-looking. He had very sort of open-minded views on the economic development in the country. And Alexander II himself. So professionalism of bureaucracy is also very important. We definitely have a problem with the political class after the Soviet Union collapsed because we had very short-term thinking, and our bureaucracy had short-term thinking, very corrupt. There was a patrimonial structures also underlying the official structures. So they were more prone to rentier behavior, rentier elite behavior than, for instance, the bureaucratic and political class in the 19th century. Of course, there was a different international environment, but as Terelyn Carl, she shows the effect of resource curse, first on the Spain and gold and silver in the 16th century. So although petroleum, we already discussed why petroleum has this effect as compared to the other commodities. She says gold had absolutely similar effect on the state and the development in Spain in the 16th century. And it's mainly because gold had the same importance and the same value internationally in the world in the 16th century as oil had in the 20th. So there is this double pressure of the international market and domestic. So what she says is actually that there is even the competition is molded by the oil interests, because oil actors are interested in cooperation. They create cartels. So there is a sort of decreased pressure for competition. So everyone, she says, behave differently in the oil-rich environment. All the actors, all institutions, because she says the stakes are so high that they change behavior of everyone. For instance, she says, the oil companies continue to operate in a highly politically risky environment. In spite of the wars, in spite of all this instability, they continue to work. I remember that famous peace pipeline project going from Afghanistan, Pakistan project, Iran, when UNICO was trying to find the sort of negotiate this security of pipeline with the warlords in Afghanistan. So the rents, because rents are so high from oil sector, it motivates, it changes the behavior of the actors. So who could give me maybe the example of success stories, in avoidance or preventing the oil curse, resource curse, or alteration of it?
There is some example like Norway or and Netherlands. Also, I think Botswana is very high in the diamond, but it can avoid the resource curse.
Absolutely, yes. Botswana is one of the cases which avoided resource curse. In case of Indonesia, it was just a pure luck in the beginning that the interest of the oil companies was delayed because of the war and things like that. And it, of course, later it was added by the decisions, the governor decisions, so harder decisions. So it was not just the structure, but it was also certain decisions in that. What to do, for instance, in countries like went really far and resource curse is sort of showing itself in its full range. Is it possible to change it? What do you think? To stop it, to reverse it? Or you also think like Terry and Carla, that we should wait for the low oil price or decline of the oil production? Okay, what do you think?
Sorry, I'm not sure I really get your question. But one thing was, I think the East Timor is also one of the interesting country. It's very much dependent on oil and gas, more than I think 90%. Since they got independent in 2000, was 2002 or something until now. But the East Timor is doing pretty well. They joined the EITI and the institution, and it's very progressing, I would say. So I think that it's one of the ultimate they are kind of following the Norway model. So East Timor is one of the interesting countries.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, indeed. We'll speak more about it, the experience of over this country. I wonder, do you assess, Professor Ibadoghlu, do you think that extractive interstate transparency initiative is capable to change the course of resource curves? Yeah.
But the problem is that extractive industry transparency initiative has the narrow mandate, cover only the revenue part of this process. The research course also has the connection with the revenue management expenditure side, and the corruption also, the potential problem when the government is going to withdraw oil money from the oil fund and they transfer to the state budget and then started the spent money. In this time, the corruption is going up, and this is the very good potential for the corruption there. There is no transparency, no accountability. Unfortunately, the EITI hopes the disclose information about how many payment from the company side, how many receive the government, and the role of the civil society, the cancellation to payment, and one from the company, another from the state. That's why this is the good, capable, but not the fully about the research course. But now that present the EITI focus some other issues, it will add value for the revenue management, for the transparency of the revenue expenditure, because the EITI start disclose the information about the beneficiary ownership, information about the contract transparency, and also focus on the commodity trading. And I think in future, maybe it will be one of the main tools avoid the research course. But anyway, the EITI, the good initiative, and also contribute to the transparency of the extractive revenues, more than 50 countries. And I hope in future it will extend, and it will also cover the not only the revenue side as well as the expenditure side of the extractive industries. And it is very, very important. But in some countries, the rich research countries, against to disclose information about the expenditure, because they argue that this is our own task. We are going to spend money in the framework of our short, mid-term, and the long-term expenditure policy. That's why we are not going to disclose this information regularly. And that's why most of the extractive industry countries, as I know, they are not ready to disclose information, how many and where, how much they spent during the reporting period, the revenue coming from the extractive industry.
But besides the transparency, there should be a pressure groups, right? Because if you just disclose the information and nothing happens, there is no consequence for that, then it doesn't have effect, right? I just think that's what at least Terrelyn Carl said. She said there should be pressure both externally and domestically on the government, on the state to change the policy, to adopt right decisions. So Maya asked the question here, what effects have been the nationalization? All the Rentier state literature considers that a major problem started of these countries when there was a nationalization of the oil companies. So if you remember my talk, I showed you that how drastically, tremendously the oil rents accrued directly to state or the government increased after nationalization of the oil companies. And our experience of 19th century Azerbaijan shows that privatization of resources, particularly if the company goes public, so the more distributed, I think, the oil ownership is, the better for the outcome. In case of Norway, we have different situation, but it's only because, as we discussed earlier, Norway had a very strong bureaucracy and strong democratic institutions, so it was possible not to get for her state institutions not to be molded by the process of centralization and resist certain incentives like, investment in non-productive sector, the revenue, as Mert mentioned, the corporate taxes versus productive taxes and individual and other goods. So quite a few strong structural influences. So nationalization in all the cases with the weak states was a bad thing, I suppose. But with in the strong states with established frameworks, both political, social, and economic, it was not as bad. I mean, that's my impression. What do you think, Professor Ibadoghlu?
Yeah, I agree your position. I also want to say that I agree the position of the Yochai Kaing about the very important to share revenue with the producing region or subnational state, and it's so important the mining country, and because the mining sector mainly located in the region, the sub region. But there is the subnational EITI in the framework of the Transparency Initiative, and the sub-national EITI also require disclose the information, how many the company pay to the local government, and the government also should disclose information about how many they receive from the companies, but unfortunately in the local level, the sub-region level, there is the participation of civil society is weak, because most of the civil society concentrate in the capital city, most of the extractive industries countries. And when we learn this situation, we saw that the problem also not from the local government side, the problem coming from the civil society side, but there is also the best experience coming from the Mongolia. Mongolia, one of the extractive industry where subnational EITI developed very well. you know, the Mongolia also the mining country. They produce a lot of the minerals, and most of the located out of the capital city. But in some countries, the oil and the gas revenue concentrate in the big city, and also it depends on the tax regime. Some countries there is no local payment. There is the centralization of the fiscal system, and even the local level some exploration, but the company paid directly to the state budget. That's also very important, yokai, in the country where operated the federal states. For example, in Nigeria also it's very important because they have the different state, and for the countries, the unitary countries, mostly the tax system also centralized. And I read the comment of the yokai, that's why I focus mostly the yokai comment. But the nationalization, privatization, also one of the tools for the award of the research course. But I am against the nationalization. I think it will be better if the state-owned companies they produce the stock. There is the two kind of the state-owned companies. Some companies belong to the state 100%. There is no any stock. There is no any share. But some countries, for example, Kazakhstan state company Kazmay Gas, they produce the stock. You can buy the Kazmay Gas stock in the London Stock Exchange, in the Tokyo Stock Exchange. If the company produces the stock, it means that the company also is taking the obligation to report in front of the shareholders. This is also one of the tools for the increasing the transparency and accountability of the state-owned companies. But if the company 100% belongs to the state, in this case there is no shareholder participation, there is no also reporting in front of the shareholders.
Mert, what do you think? For instance, one of the recommendations which were left in the folder for reading, Paul Collier gives a set of recommendations on what to do. Do you think that this sort of recommendations at the level of World Bank or international financial institutions, they may alter the situation in the countries which are already touched by resource curves?
And by now we over the time.
No, I thought we have 2 hours, no?
Yeah, but the 2 hours, past 2 hours, that's why.
Okay, so
Maybe next time we will discuss.
Okay, so if the
publication of the poll cover.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
There is a comment coming from the Mert Uzun.
So
Comment.
that's my first course. I cannot choose them. And no, I think your comments were very relevant and very useful. So don't worry, you know, we're all learning. It's not just you who's learning. We're learning in the discussion, and that's important. So we're learning from you. And thank you for your questions. I suppose we should finish now. So maybe, Professor, you would like to make an announcement for the next time? Or?
Yeah, I'm going to upload one of the reading materials today for the next class. Next time we will focus on the past thesis. I think it will be helpful if you read this publication before the class. And that's all I want to share. Thank you so much for your participation, for your contribution. Have a good day. And
thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Mert, Yokai, and Somaya for your courageous participation. So until the next time, have a good week.
thank you. Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye.
Leyla Hanım,
Aha.
ben bilmirdim ki sizin belə babanız, nənəniz. Çok maraqlı geldi. Bunlar başlı.
Recordingi ben çıkartabilmirəm. O
Mən
recording
onu stop elədim. Yəqin ki, onlarda
Yox, o göstərir ki, şey eləyir.
var. Pause recording.
Pause recording elədim.